Serbian game development studio Ebb Software was founded in 2013 and set out to create a game with a very specific experience in mind. A sci-fi horror game that threw you into its world with little context or assistance, where the setting was a character in itself, unsettling and unnerving the player with how repulsively inhumane their surroundings were. Making a sci-fi setting feel sufficiently alien is enough of a task in itself, but to make it feel oppressively alien is something else entirely. The development of Scorn was pretty slow going, with a proof of concept trailer being revealed, followed by an unsuccessful Kickstarter campaign. Ebb Software eventually received private funding to continue development, and the game that was originally planned to be released in 2 parts was now going to be released as one whole. Then they decided to attempt a second Kickstarter, this time being successful. For a while, details about Scorn were not widely known besides the fact that it was a sci-fi horror game with a disgusting biomechanical aesthetic that is heavily inspired by the works of H.R. Giger and Sezherad Beksinski, the most unfortunately Polish name I find myself trying to pronounce more than I would like because I am a fan of his work. The styles of both men live on within Scorn as the game proudly wears its artistic inspirations on its sleeve to deliver some of the most harrowing visuals any game has given us. But one thing about Scorn has become more and more clear as we draw closer to its launch: its purpose. It wasn't simply a game using its Giger and Beksinski influence to gain some clout. It was a project that was fully devoted to a deliberately paced, atmospherically powered survival horror experience. The developers themselves have even gone out of their way to mention that while the game has shooting in it, it was not a shooter at heart. With this in mind, what is the experience of Scorn like? Well, I've finished the game and I'm ready to go into those gritty, fleshy details. So without any further ado, let's head into the review. I've already mentioned the strength of Scorn's artistic direction, and that wasn't an exaggeration. Even in the main menu before the game actually starts, the game's style is known and overpowering, and it only gets stronger from there. No expense or opportunity was spared in making it extremely obvious that you are inhabiting an oppressively alien world that strikes you with heavy unease. The surroundings are mechanical, yet also eerily biological in nature. The machines that you interact with and tools you discover have disgustingly fleshy features, and even bleed when they're damaged or unplugged from things. It's as if whatever alien race inhabited this world developed an obsession with the humanoid form and anatomy, and found a way to use blood and meat as a form of power. And in true H.R. Giger fashion, there's a lot of weirdly phallic imagery and shapes to be found. But the biomechanical aesthetic doesn't just evoke unnerving sensations on its own. It's combined with a particularly revolting and casual cruelty that pervades the whole game. Scorn is gory, and that gore is presented with an inhumane sense of coldness that we are simply meant to accept as not only part of the game, but as part of the entire world the game inhabits. It's a world where it seems as though pain is the greatest sensation. Pain is what leads to personal transcendence. It's really unsettling and helps a lot in creating that disconcerting atmosphere you're showered with before you even begin the game. Of course, another big contributor to the atmosphere is the audio design and mixing. The eerie, creepy, disgusting otherworldliness of Scorn comes through sonically as well. Nasty, moist squelching, meaty thuds and footsteps, unexplainable creaks and cranks, the nearby groans and screeches of enemies that may or may not actually be there. It creates a tension and paranoia that makes the setting that much more uneasy. Music is also an extension of this. The game's original soundtrack features lots of heavy, droning synthetic noises that are just as alienating and abrasive. Usually I start a review off by going into detail about the story, but frankly, Scorn features no clear narrative to speak of. There's no named characters in the game, there's no dialogue, no narration, and not even any in-world text to read like notes, journals, or computer files. There is such an absence of a clear plot that the game doesn't even have an option for subtitles, because it doesn't need it. The only real story you need to grasp is that we are playing a character who is clearly seeking to leave this hellish, destitute planet of constant suffering, as it seems to have been abandoned and left to the control of apparently parasitic entities. But with art, sound, and story, or lack of one, out of the way, the greater question remains. What the hell kind of game is Scorn anyway? It's been labeled a ton of different ways, some of which are accurate, and some of which are laughably untrue. Is it a horror game? Yes, absolutely. Perhaps not in the typical way you might expect from the usual horror games that go viral because of people screaming at their monitors while they play, but its deeply unnerving atmosphere cannot be denied. Scorn also has weapons, so is it a shooter? No. Do not mistake the presence of weapons in this game as a focus towards action. This is one huge mistake that I've seen people make already, and it's in spite of the developers themselves outright stating that the game is not a shooter. Yes, there is combat in the game, but its inclusion feels incidental if anything. Would I describe it as an adventure game? Honestly, no. Primarily because the use of the word adventure as a genre in and of itself is extremely broad and nebulous and not helpful at all in accurately describing the content of the game. Does it have interconnected levels or some type of non-linearity? Interconnected levels, kind of, but non-linearity, no. This is a strange one because it actually does appear in some of the game's marketing, and it's just straight up not true. Scorn is actually quite linear. Sure, some specific areas are a little maze-like, with maybe a few optional rooms scattered throughout the game with something to grab, but actual progress is pretty straightforward. Out of all the labels the game has had, I would say the most accurate is probably survival horror, and I use that term in the most old-school kind of way. The kind of survival horror that is focused almost entirely on puzzles and avoiding enemies more often than confronting them. Honestly, if Scorn had tank controls and a static camera, it would be undeniable. I've also seen people say it's structurally like Myst, but with occasional combat, and that's honestly not too far off the mark either. So if the game is essentially divided into walking, puzzles, and occasional combat, then how are they? Well, as you might have guessed already by my praise of the atmosphere, art direction, visuals, and audio, the mere act of walking around and taking in the dreadful, horrific, disgusting surroundings is actually quite incredible. Ebb Software went all in on everything relating to the world of Scorn. Honestly, if the game didn't even have puzzles or combat at all, and was just 3 hours of walking forward and being mesmerized by the locales, architecture, and general grotesqueries, I would almost be just as entertained. That's how much heavy lifting the presentation is doing. But that doesn't necessarily mean the puzzles are bad though. Their presence is stronger than the combat, so it's only natural to hope that they would at least be interesting. And by and large, they are. Ebb Software managed to somehow make puzzles that would normally be mundane a bit more interesting by simply adapting them to the art style. For example, the first big interaction you have with the world around you after starting the game is a slide puzzle. One of the most boring puzzles you can possibly put in your game, but it's made much easier to tolerate because it somehow blends so well with the repulsive yet still strangely alluring world. And some of them are genuinely fairly challenging too. I imagine someone who sucks at puzzles might get stuck at some of them for an embarrassingly long time, especially since the game is extremely averse to providing any sense of direction to the player. It's entirely up to you to walk around and find out where to go next, or just refer to a walkthrough. And the combat, well, that's much more divisive, at least from what I've already been seeing from people online. As a survival horror game, a very traditional one at its core, minus the static camera and tank controls, Scorn treats combat not as an inviting method to making progress, but actually more as a punishment for not having patience. There are very few enemy encounters in Scorn that are mandatory. In fact, I think there's just 2, and they are the final bosses. From what I can tell, every common enemy type that spawns on the map has a certain patrol route with numerous tunnels acting as despawn points, meaning that if you avoid enemies, they will eventually just straight up leave. Avoiding enemies isn't just safer. It seems like the game itself wants you to choose that way of dealing with them, because enemies are surprisingly relentless in this game, capable of high aggression and really good tracking and accuracy in the case of ranged attacks. But the game offers no real stealth or cover mechanics to defend yourself effectively. Your only tactic here besides fighting back is to just run. Combat in this game is just as deliberately paced as everything else. It is not Doom, which a small percentage of people seemed to expect from this game. Not by a long shot. There's 4 weapons in total that you can acquire, and they are all mandatory. A melee dick-punching machine that's borderline useless, a pistol that's pretty reliable, a shotgun that actually kicks ass, and a grenade launcher that's actually used mostly for story-related progress instead of fighting. So basically, you only have 2 weapons worth using, and luckily, they are pretty good. And no, you cannot upgrade them. Not that you would need to. So generally speaking, combat in Scorn is clearly not meant to be a particularly fun time, and to an extent it may even feel like an afterthought, as if ebb Software decided that some fighting was an obligatory addition they threw in reluctantly. Now, I don't think combat is bad per se, because I was willing to play the game on its own terms by accepting that combat was only the last-ditch effort and preferring to avoid direct encounters whenever I could. So when I did find myself in a somewhat desperate situation, I was able to use the guns effectively and get myself out. They do their job, and that's about the best I can say about the combat. If there are any other aspects of the game worth touching on, there's the autosave system. Scorn does not have manual saves. It's entirely automatic, like, say, Dark Souls. The game saves periodically every time you do something and after a certain amount of time passes. And I bring this up because it seems a bit finicky with how far back the game sends you when you die. Now, I did not test this exhaustively because I only died, I think, 3 times in my whole playthrough, but I was sent back anywhere from mere seconds before death to about 4 minutes or so ago, even though I did a lot more in the latter scenario where the game must have had multiple more opportunities to autosave. It's a bit inconsistent, but again, I did not test exhaustively, so take this criticism with a grain of salt. It ultimately did not impact my experience much because I simply did not die that often. Overall, Scorn is something else. It's a game some will love because it is undeniably a new standard for artistic direction and horrific alien atmosphere, and because it dares to be a sci-fi game that focuses more on walking and puzzle solving than combat. Others will hate it for that exact same reason, calling the game boring, obtuse, and downright frustrating. And honestly, they are completely within their rights to feel that way. And even though I would say that I do like the game, I can at least see where they're coming from, because Scorn is the type of game that is, without question, made exactly how the developers wanted it to be made. A game like this is not in development for 6 years or more just to accidentally end up being a 3-hour-long survival horror game with more walking and puzzle solving than slow, unremarkable combat. And yes, the game is 3 hours long, maybe 4 or 5 if you really walk around a lot or really suck at puzzles. It's a game that puts its foot down and tells you how you're going to experience it, tells you that you have to play it by its rules or not play at all. And this undoubtedly alienates a lot of people. But for anyone who is on the same page as Scorn, either initially or gradually as they play, it hits, and it hits hard. It'll be a very worthwhile experience that they will think about forever. And I have a lot of respect for developers and games that have a very specific vision that not many will enjoy, but they stick to their guns anyway. Game development has become so expensive and time-consuming that a lot of studios are just too risk-averse or just plain chicken shit to create a game that might piss a huge portion of their potential player base off within the first 30 minutes because of how cryptic or slow it is by design. If you are a person who believes the industry is creatively stagnant, then you should hope more games like Scorn are made. Because this is what it means for the industry to be truly artistically free. The ability to create a game that aggravates people who don't play that game on its own terms. A lot of people will bitch and moan about it, but the fact that these games can exist without being an automatic death sentence for their studio is a true mark of a medium's maturity. Even I don't enjoy every game that's so stubbornly designed like this, but I can respect that they are here and uncompromising on their vision. This concludes my review of Scorn. It's a one-of-a-kind game that I feel everyone should at least give a shot at some point, even if they think they won't enjoy it. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you around.